this session's going to be fun, I think. And I do these sessions basically for fun. I do them because a lot of us are really skeptical of coaching and skeptical of the concepts. And so when you come, you get less skeptical. We're kind of trained to be skeptical, particularly in medicine. And so I like to do these and have people come, and then they get to experience it. And then maybe they go back and watch all the other ones too, as Jillian did. So this topic came about because so many people tell me this, that they're responsible for everything and everybody, and they feel so weighed down and so heavy because of that. And in coaching, well, and I'll actually say that for many of us, we have a lot of responsibilities, and they're heavy responsibilities. And many of us actually take responsibility for everyone and everything because of some of our default thought patterns. And so I wanted to talk about why we think that, and then what we can do about it to change it. And I actually think it's twofold, because sometimes we talk about changing your thoughts, and sometimes we talk about changing circumstances. And I would say this is one we actually need to do both. But we always change our thoughts first. And so this idea that we take care of everybody and everything, or we're responsible for everybody and everything, I say it's an expensive thought, because when you think it, you feel really heavy. I have chest pressure, even just saying it. I'm like, oh, and I definitely used to say that and think that in my house. I have 3 kids, and I actually also took responsibility for everybody and everything. And so we'll talk a little bit about this idea of toxic independence, which gets us into doing that. But it's because it's kind of amusing. We actually think that we can do it better, which actually usually we can, because we're very highly organized, efficient, productive, smart people. But we think that we can do it better, so we do it better, and then other people don't help us, and then we're resentful and bitter that they don't help us, and we have to take care of everybody and everything. So part of this work is actually noticing these expensive thoughts, because when you think that thought that you are responsible for taking care of everyone and everything, or you have to take care of everyone and everything, whatever your version of that thought is, you feel heavy, you feel tired, you feel bitter, you feel frustrated, and usually we feel resentful that other people aren't helping us. And so I like to have you just notice that that thought is not really very helpful. And even, I will add, if it's true. And so even if it's true, you could tweak it. And I like to change like words, thoughts, stories. So you could say I have a full life, which is very different than I'm responsible for everyone and everything. Or in my case, maybe I have a lot of people that I love and care about, or I have a lot of things that I love and care about, or I have a lot of things I love to do. But I think when you change the phrasing, it's this full life is actually the one that I like the best, because it sort of can replace all the things. And it feels to me much more neutral than I'm responsible for everybody and everything. So part of this is thinking about words, stories, thoughts that feel different as a way to describe what's going on. And then you also have to become aware of how you think at baseline. And so most of us, women in general, and women in medicine in particular, suffer from something called over-responsibility, which basically we take responsibility for things that are not our responsibility. To be fair, in medical training, we were taught to do that, but we also do it at home, and we take responsibility for things that maybe are our kids' responsibility, or our husband's responsibility, or our parents' responsibility as they age. And we tend to think that if we don't do that, something bad will happen. That's sort of how we were trained, and that we are maybe not a good doctor, not a good mom, not a good daughter if we don't do that. And so this idea of over-responsibility resonates with most people that I know. And when you think about this idea that I'm responsible for everyone and everything, I actually immediately try to go to, what am I taking responsibility for that's not mine? Or what am I trying to fix that's not mine? Or what am I trying to control or manage that's not mine? So I think that's really helpful to realize that that's one of those default thought patterns that we have in medicine. And it comes from a fear of making a mistake, fear of failure, fear of rejection. fear of judgment. And all of that is actually true when you're training, for example, but it's not necessarily true now. It's not necessarily true in your household. And I think a lot of the times we tend to catastrophize. Like, if I don't take responsibility for all this, something terrible is going to happen to my child, something terrible is going to happen to my patients. I know I used to not want to delegate things to my MA because she might not do it, or she might not do it as well, or I would have to double check. And so instead, it was often easier to just do it yourself, except that then that gets you into that over responsibility pattern, and you're exhausted and bitter and resentful and tired. And then the other people don't actually learn how to do it. So that's one of the reasons that we get caught in this. The other one is that toxic independence I mentioned. I'm exceptional at this one, which is that we are exceptional humans. So we're really good at doing all the things. And so we just do them ourselves because it's faster and easier. And then say your partner does something, they don't do it as well. So you just take over, you criticize how they do it. So you end up doing everything. And then we're frustrated because we have responsibility for everyone and everything. And so that also comes from like the catastrophizing, fear of making a mistake, fear of something bad happening. We're trained to think about what bad thing could happen. That's just how our brains work. We're also trained to have urgency bias. And so if it's faster for us to do it, we want to do it because that is much more comfortable. And we love to be in control, just saying. So if you do it yourself, then you get to be in control. Same thing though, you have this harm, bitter resentment. And what I mean by harm is that it's not sustainable. So if you're a physician and a mom and all these other things, you can't do it all. Partner, dog mom, like you can't do all of it yourself. And so when we take over, and that's why I call it toxic independence, because we often think independence is good, but when it's harming you, it's not helpful. And sometimes people say, well, how do I know if it's over responsibility versus appropriate responsibility? And I would say when you end up bitter, resentful, exhausted, and burnt out, that's the over responsibility. And the same is true for the other two that I'd like to mention, which are, and they just sound awful, by the way, so I just throw them out there: self-sacrifice and martyrdom. And we were all trained to sacrifice ourselves, and we were all trained to be martyrs. And when I trained, that was glorified. Like, the more of a martyr you were, the better doctor you were, the more of a martyr you were, the better mom you were. So for women in medicine, it's like a double whammy. The more of a martyr you are, the better daughter you are, right? And so I think a lot of this is rooted in good, right? We want to serve other people. We want to show up with love for the people we love. But when we are willing to sacrifice ourselves and be martyrs, you're actually sacrificing yourself in a martyr, and you end up thinking you're responsible for everyone and everything, and you're frustrated about it. And so where I say it's like the over part is when you're bitter and resentful and exhausted and burnt out from it, or even when you think it, you just feel this like chest pressure or pit in your stomach, wherever you tend to carry it. That is, that's where it's a problem as opposed to helpful. I like to say, rather than sacrificing yourself or rather than service, like caring. What would caring do? Caring wouldn't sacrifice yourself or be a martyr, but caring can care for others and care for you all at the same time. And that kind of guides you to not get into this over, I'll just use the word over. The other thing that all those tend to lead to is people leaving medicine and people killing themselves. I mean, it sounds terrible, but that's really what's happening. And these unrealistic expectations of ourselves. We also then tend to judge other people we work with or other family members because they're not doing as much as we are. And so we tend to get this unhealthy, tension-filled culture that we're into. So I think if you can see the way that you are showing up for all of these things, it's really helpful. Most of the time, all you actually need to do is see it, and then you can decide, like, well, do I want to do it here or not? And you don't have to get into all the fixing or replacing the thoughts if you are understanding where you're coming from. So we tend to be coming from, as I mentioned, that catastrophizing. So worrying something terrible is going to happen. Some of the others I didn't mention are lack of trust. So we were taught not to trust other people. We were taught to trust and confirm, right? And if something went wrong, even if it was someone else's responsibility, it was actually our fault. And so we tend to carry that forward in the rest of our lives. We also tend to be people pleasers. So we want everyone to like us. So therefore we just do things because then we know that we can do it our own way. And I mentioned the others, like fear of making a mistake. We like to fix and be in control. And urgency is the other one. So what I like to do is start to ask other questions, like what would happen if you didn't do it and you let others step in? Because we always say, well, the worst thing would happen, right? It would be worse than I expect, or terrible things would happen. And so asking these questions, like, what if it would turn out better if someone else did it? And I know many people are like, no, it won't. But I would offer that it could. And sometimes we just need to try it. And that can make a huge difference. I often say to people, try it. You can always go back to doing it all yourself if you want. Like if it's really terrible and it turns out badly. So the first step here is to feeling less burdened and to letting go of these thoughts is, first of all, to notice that you think it and to notice how it makes you feel. And then to see where it comes from. Because if you understand where it's coming from, you can actually sort of detach from it. When it's inside you and it's just ruling the day, that's not really very helpful. But when you see it and you're like, oh, that's my catastrophizing or my fear of something terrible happening, that's why I'm doing it. Or I just like to call out my toxic independence, and whichever one it is, like it's always very obvious to me. And then I can decide. Sometimes you do want to do it yourself, but you don't have to do everything yourself. It's going to help you decide what's important. Then the other one, which I always mention, and I've actually mentioned in all of these sessions, is that you have to have a calm nervous system, because you're not going to change if you feel threatened. You're not going to change if you're in fight or flight or sympathomimic storm. You can't decide that you're going to let someone else try something when you're in under stress to that degree. And so that's where I always bring the mindfulness in. I think it's super important, because your nervous system is calm. You're not going to be able to see these thoughts. You're not going to be able to change them. And you're definitely not going to be able to change the actions, which comes down the line. If you're also super depleted, which many of us are, you also can't change from a place of empty. Nobody is willing to change. And so noticing what you can do, I always say, to replete yourself. As long as you have a little bit there in your battery and you're not totally empty, you can usually begin to make change. But the more replete you are, the more change you can make. And then the other thing is you have to be nice to yourself about this. So if you say that you're acting from toxic independence and you're judging yourself and you're like, I can't believe I'm doing that. It's so unhelpful. Why do I do that? Or, from being frustrated with yourself about your old patterns, doesn't work. So being kind about how you got here. And I always like to say it's not our fault, which makes me feel better. It's just the way we were trained, and it's cultural. And then we can decide how we want to move forward. And sometimes people feel like, well, it's cultural, so I have to stay doing it. And what I would say is we each have to begin to change so the culture changes. And when each of us change, even a tiny bit, things tend to change for the better. And then you can bring in these coaching tools. And so the coaching tools are asking better questions is the one I like. So is this mine to fix? Can someone else do it? And so you can start to ask that, because we tend to ask, well, why isn't anyone helping me? That's a not helpful question. Why do I have to do this myself? And so what terrible thing might happen? So instead of thinking about, is this mine to fix? Is it even in my control? Because oftentimes we spend time trying to take care of things and fix them and take responsibility for them when they're not even in our control. And the other thought that I have is, especially for us who feel like we have to care for everyone and everything, and if you use that word care, like what would caring actually do? Because caring wouldn't actually sacrifice yourself, if that makes sense. Caring would take good care of you, because if you sacrifice yourself, you can't actually care for everybody long term. You can in the short term, but not in the long term. And then my favorite questions are, what would love do? Because that always guides me. Love would not sacrifice yourself. It would not take responsibility for everyone and everything, because we know that we can't keep doing that long term. So a better question would be, what would sustainability do? I really like that question, because it guides you to sort of like, oh, well, this is not sustainable. So sustainability might get help. Sustainability might let spouse, partner, friend, colleague do something, even if they don't do it as well, because in the long term, they'll learn how to do it. Or maybe people will learn from them doing it differently. The other one I love is, what would trust do? Like if you trusted the other person, you trusted yourself, you trusted your children, letting them learn from their mistakes, for example. Remembering that we were trained not to trust. And so for most of us, we really have to work on this. You think about it, we were trained to, and when I trained, you had to make sure the nurses actually like did your order. And it was like, putting it in was not good enough. You had to follow through and make sure they actually gave it, which is really not your job. But we were kind of trained to do that. And I think that that carries over to, I worked in clinic and a lot of people did not trust their MA. And you really want to, like, we were partnered with an MA one-to-one. We really do need to trust them and need to figure out how to trust each other. And so I think when we're bringing this lack of trust, we end up taking responsibility for everything, and it ends up being not sustainable. So the other question that I like to ask, and I will say that we often are responsible for too many things, but then the question is it true that you are responsible for all these things? Like, what you may want to look at, our brain tends to see it that way, but what do others actually take responsibility for? I work with a lot of people on relationship coaching, and most people think their husbands do nothing, but then you start to talk about it and they actually come up with a lot of things that they do. But they're not things that are kind of on their radar. They usually take care of the cars. It's usually a little bit sexist, but either way, they do it. And it's like, oh, wow, actually they do take out the trash, and oh, wow, they actually do these things. And so part of it is being onto your brain and saying, like, what do other people do? What are they really good at? I think also, I've worked with a number of people recently where they've tried to, like, there's this thing called fair play, where partners are supposed to do equal things. And I would say, actually, I don't think equal is good. I think you look at what each person's really good at and what they enjoy and maximize that, because then it's easier for everyone. And so figuring out what the other person, either in your relationship or in your clinic, like, what is your MA really good at? And as long as it's in her scope of practice, let them do more of that, for example. And so I think really looking at, like, what are your kids really good at, right? They don't all have to do the same thing, or you don't have to have like certain responsibilities. We can allow people to do things they're good at and things they love. So I think that that can actually be a really helpful thing, is to question, like, what are other people already taking responsibility for? What are you not having to care for? Even if it's one thing, because our brain tells us that it's not just one thing. And so I think that can be really, really helpful. And sometimes you need to make a list. And then this idea I mentioned before, is it yours to fix? Can you actually fix it? Is it actually in your control? Oftentimes we are I remember in clinic, trying to take responsibility for things that were like up at the medical system level, and there's no way I can take control over that. And so when something's out of your control, letting it go. And there are often a lot of things in parenting and relationships totally out of your control. And if you let it go, it's way easier. And then the other question I like to ask is, could you step back and let others step in and see what happens? So most of us are like, no, I can't do that. Something terrible will happen. That's the catastrophizing. But what if, I like to always say, like, what would they learn from trying? What, like, if it's a partner and you think that they can't handle the kids well, what would the kids learn from this other style? And I often have learned, once I started to do this, my husband sometimes had better ways of doing it, even though I was really sure he didn't. And so particularly with one kid, or that may be different. Same thing, I think, with staff and colleagues. Like, we often think our way is the better way, but we can often learn from other people's way. It's just different. And that's okay. So I think realizing that they might learn, and even if they fail, what will they learn from that? We often think that's not acceptable. Like, you can't have failure, you can't have mistakes. That's in what we're taught in medicine, but in every other field, you can have failure and mistakes, and it's considered learning. And 95% of the time in medicine, that's also true. I think if you can, put it in that category where if it could cause serious harm, you can still take care of it yourself, but 99% of the time it doesn't. So I love that question. What's the worst that could happen if I let someone else try to do this? And we're often very surprised that it goes better than we think. So I often say, what if it goes better than you think? Or what if it's not as bad as you think? Sometimes we have to start there. Because if we're like, what if it's better than I think? We're like, nope, it's definitely not better than I think. But what if it doesn't turn out as badly as you think? I think that can be super helpful. And so I think those questions actually allow you to delegate some things. They allow you to get help even when you're uncomfortable. The other thing to remember is that in medicine, we were taught if we were uncomfortable, something bad was going to happen. But if you're uncomfortable, it's also just that you're doing it differently. So you might be uncomfortable when you delegate, or uncomfortable when you don't take responsibility for everything. But it actually doesn't mean that something bad's going to happen. It's just uncomfortable because we haven't done it. It's not familiar. And so when you realize that, you can actually sort of, I always say, relax into it. And then one other point that I think is really worthwhile is that I see a lot of people who are not able to put their own oxygen mask on first. Like, that's too uncomfortable. They're not going to do that above patients or above their children or above something else. And so I like to say, just put your own oxygen mask on too. And if you're sacrificing yourself and you're being a martyr and you're being toxic, independent, and over responsible, you're not putting your own oxygen mask on. So if you don't do that, it's not sustainable. And so the thought here is that the thought is dangerous itself, because the thought makes us feel terrible. So even if it's true at this moment, think a different thought. And you can come up with a better one than I like to think I have a full life. But I think that thought, telling ourselves that, makes us feel terrible. And so if you look at sort of the coaching model, when you feel terrible, you are not acting your best. And then you actually usually end up responsible for everyone and everything, exhausted, burdened. And that's not a good loop. And so if we can realize even that thought is harmful, then you can pick a different one, or a more neutral one, if that makes sense. And then how can you also shift it? So if we do happen to be someone who takes responsibility for most things, where can you give up some of that responsibility? Where is the over responsibility causing you harm, exhaustion, disconnection? And so I think it's really this stepping back and being mindful without judgment. It's like, let me just see how this is playing out and where I have room to tweak things. Remembering that you have no room to tweak things when you're super stressed. And so you have to learn how to do a little mindfulness, breathe, something to upregulate your parasympathetic nervous system or your calm, and go from there. So those were my thoughts. I let multiple other people in and I don't see any of them, so I don't know what happened, but that's okay. They're either listening in the background or let me just actually see. I'm just going to click one button. Yeah, see, there are other people here. I don't know why I can't see them though.
Do you have it on hide non-video participants?
I'm checking here. That's what it was. Thanks. Yeah, I clicked that the other day. Now I remember. Thank you, Jillian. You're awesome. Now I can see everybody. That happened to me when I was teaching yoga this morning too. I was like, it says there's all these people. I don't see anybody. It was very strange, but you've solved my problem. Thank you. Look at that, getting help. So does anybody have questions, thoughts, anything there resonate?
I'd say resonate on all this. I remember as an intern, one of my downfalls, just like cascaded my downfall, was this exact topic, because I thought carrying the pager meant that I had to solve every problem by myself the moment someone came in, and I was coming into a surgical specialty where I knew that the things coming in, I wouldn't have all the skills to be able to address, and that the risk could be high, a lot higher than my risk tolerance and other aspects. So it would make me fearful of being on call. So I would then lose sleep because I was anticipating all of it. And then I would stalk, like, you're not supposed to stalk the ED, but I would stalk the ED, try to prepare for it. And that level of anxiety and belief that I had to take care of it. And then my co-residents allowed me to take care of it. So then I was also exhausted and resentful. And then we weren't that
It's
triad.
like this snowball effect,
Yeah.
right?
And so then I couldn't also ask for help and delegate, because then I thought that they would think I was micromanaging, and all of that led. So if anyone knows, I left that for 3 years later. I just couldn't, like, that all cascaded, and eventually I'm like, had I just asked for help, things would have been a lot different. So appreciate this topic.
We also have a culture, I didn't mention that asking for help is weak. And asking for help means that you're not as good a doctor, human, mom, like you can't handle it, which is not that at all. I think asking for help is a sign of strength, and also not knowing. We tend to hide all the not knowing, and that creates more anxiety too. And then I think we carry that over into other parts of our life. And doesn't feel so great either. Anyone else have thoughts on this one? Which is the one that gets you most in trouble? Mine is toxic independence. That's it. I could just tell you that. Is that yours too? Yeah. When I learned about that, I was like, oh, that's me. Now I understand all of my problems, not all of them, but it like really clarified a lot. Nancy, do you have that?
Yes, I would say I do, definitely.
Yeah. What do you think? Do you think any of these tips will help? Which is the one that feels
Yeah, I think over the years I've become increasingly better at not taking control of all things and realizing it is going to be fine. But I have to pay attention. And it's a really important thing, and it's something I often hear from others as well. So I think you describe it well in terms of medical practice. You often see it. So it certainly parenting, yeah. And sharing of tasks with partners for sure.
And I think once you know about it and see it, it's so much easier to step out of it than when you don't know about it and you're just kind of in it. It's really uncomfortable. And I think for those of us who are over functioners, we just get into the habit of over functioning. We don't even know what it would look like to not over function.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Heather, which one is yours specialty? Let's put it in quotes.
Yeah, I mean, it's all very interesting. I just want to comment on what you said. I love the change, the thought when you said, I have a full life. Yeah. That really, yeah. I mean,
oh, good.
Which is, and the thing that really speaks to me is that sort of catastrophic thinking, what's the worst that's going to happen, right? And changing that thought as well, but also the idea that you probably can handle it, right? Whatever it is. But yeah, I love the full life. I'm going to use that one. That's great.
That feels like wonderful, right? You're over capacity and you're like, I just have a full life. I will say that to myself sometimes. I just have a full life. All these children calling me with problems, but I just have a full life. It's a little hard when things are really challenging, but I think that, the story we tell so much impacts our experience of the situation. And so when we say, I'm responsible for everything, it's like, and then all of a sudden it's exhausting. And I think also when you mentioned we can handle it, but we don't handle it well when we think the thought, I'm responsible for everything. Like we don't bring our best to it. When we think I have a full life, we bring our most creative minds and our best problem solving. And we actually probably can handle it all. We can probably even do double. But I think when you notice the energy with which you come to all the things in your life, it's really helpful to really think, I love that it's a full life. I'm still trying to come up with another one, but that one works for almost everybody. I'm like, your life is just very full. Isn't that wonderful? And I think sometimes you have to say it with a little sarcasm or a little loving amusement, like if it's really full, or you can just have a really full life this week. But I think, when we describe like it's always a terrible week, or it was just like the worst week, or it was so exhausting, it was too much. And so again, watching the words that we use, even one word can change so much. And so that's one of the most beautiful things I've discovered in coaching is the power of words. And so I love to play with words and say, like, which one feels better? And you will find the one that works for you. And it might actually be a different one for each person. And once you have a better sense of like what sits with you and what feels right, it actually allows you to really work with your brain. So I like to work with my own brain. Like if I say a phrase and it really is wonderful, I'm like, oh, well, my brain likes that. So what else is like that? And you can actually start to make more and more shifts when you start to figure out what works well for you. Anyone, I'm happy to give any coaching on it. I mean, all that I shared, like those are pearls and you'll be all set. Not all set. It takes practice, right? This is not something that happens overnight, but I think once you have these ideas, you just kind of play with them and figure out the me as well as the other one that I really like to bring to it, because I've met a whole bunch of people who really don't resonate with putting your oxygen mask on first. And this idea, especially if you're raised in a religious background, like the self-sacrifice and martyrdom, they're not really willing to let that go. But the idea of putting their own oxygen mask on, like you actually need one when the plane is going down, as long as everybody can get one. We go to the scarcity mindset, like who's going to go first and what's going to happen. And my thought is just put your own on at all, and you'll be in better shape. And so I think for some people, that's like dipping a toe in, that makes it a little bit easier to adjust to the whole situation, if that makes sense. Any of those that you really struggle with, or something that I said that you think like, I won't be able to do that? You're just all going to go out and do it all. I'm giggling. I do think also one of the other things I mentioned is just like that thought is expensive. Oh yeah, Nancy, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that I think sometimes too, or at least I personally have a tendency to, when I hear about something, to want to fix it. And not always when you hear about it are people looking for someone to fix it. Mm-hmm. And I happen to be the mother of 3 now grown daughters. And that's something you learn over time. Sometimes they just want to tell you about something and not really necessarily looking for a problem solver. So there's a tendency sometimes to take that on when we're not even being asked for it.
I love that, because I always say we're fixers, managers, and controllers. We're experts, and we immediately jump into that. And so that's where I'd like to say, is it mine to fix? And I like your other question. Do they want me to fix it? Are they asking me to fix it? Because I think oftentimes you're right, your children are not asking you to fix it, or even a friend is not asking you to fix it, but we jump right in and then we feel burdened by all the responsibility. And so I think that's a great question. I do that too. Just saying. I have 3 almost grown sons, same thing. I like to fix their problems. There's actually a study which is so interesting of moms, and they had moms and kids, and they had this very difficult problem to solve on the computer. And they had heart rate monitors on both of them. And what they discovered is that while they were trying to solve it and it wasn't solved, the mom's heart rates were going sky high while the child wasn't figuring it out. The moms would go in and solve it, and their heart rates would go way down, and then the children's heart rates would go way up because they didn't, they were trying to figure it out. And so it's really interesting. That's the same thing of us feeling like we have to solve it urgently and we have to get out of that discomfort. And that study has actually really changed my thinking about parenting. Like, you actually want the kids to work through it and struggle. And clearly they want to, right? It stresses them out when you come in and solve the problem. We talk in peds about, I'm a pediatrician, snowplow parents. And that causes children so much stress. And they end up in the end, not having the skills they need to solve problems. And so I think it's cool. That study actually really, it changed my thinking. And one of the things I love about sort of blending coaching and mindfulness is the physiology around it. When you learn the physiology of the nervous system, and you're sort of learning how breathing shifts things and how mindfulness shifts things physiologically, it makes so much sense why, if you're thinking about like in sympathomimetic storm, why you're unwilling to change. And if you feel threatened or you feel like someone is at risk, or if you're going to be judged, for example, of not doing it. I'm thinking of you, Jillian. I'm sure you were in sympathomimetic storm there, right? Of course you couldn't change. Because we don't change when we're threatened, because our heart rate is going and our brain is shutting down and our amygdala can't think. And so when you start to think about the physiology of it, to me, it makes it so clear the path forward, and also clear why we're stuck. And I love interrupting those loops, if that makes sense.
I also think that when we give, so we have an excellent PA here. She's type A. I trust what she does, right? Because she's exactly like we are. And like those personalities, I trust what they're doing. And I think that like as a resident, I valued that the attending would let you go in and would, like, if the attending would trust you versus one that wouldn't trust you, then you have low self-confidence and doubt yourself more. So it's our gift to that person to give them trust that they can do a good job. And then of course it's hard. I think it's easier to let, like you were saying, if the risks are lower. Yeah. Right. I was just, all of this stuff came up. I just finished grad school and we had group projects, which I hated. Of course I did it myself. And I tried to delegate. I tried to give space, and I was really disappointed. And so I'm like, man, but that was because my grade was tied to it. Had my grade not been impacted, I think it would have been a lesson. I tried to get the teacher to cut me off just so I could do it show them they had to be self-sufficient. So, and then my mom came, and we've talked about neurodivergence a lot. So I have, since a kid, maybe a little OCD, and I hated that about myself, that if things weren't done my way, I'd get very distressed about it. And I couldn't stand that. It's not somebody that I would want to live with. And it's very disruptive to my day when, like, the shoes are in the middle of the room, like, why are they there? My mom puts things weird in the fridge, and like, why isn't this like categorized? But I laugh about it now because it no longer distresses me to the capacity that it used to. Now I laugh about it. And like you said, well, there's more than one way to do things. I'm grateful my mom is visiting me. How do I want to show up so that she enjoys her experience here? Yeah. But when you were saying there's more than one way to do things, that's what I kept saying to myself. We actually had a really enjoyable time. And now sometimes when she's here, I throw my shoes in the middle of the floor. I put crap wherever it wants to go in the fridge. And it's just like, okay, it helps us to relax and just to realize, like, the world will not explode if those minor things that really have no consequence are not perfect.
Yeah. And even if you're not OCD in medicine, we were trained there is only one way to do it. It's a right way and a wrong way. And if you don't follow the policies, procedures, and protocols, which is actually kind of funny, because if I think about my career in peds, like, what was the right way when I first started was the wrong way 10 years in, right? And we learned that it actually changed, but it's a very much right, wrong culture, black, white culture. And so it makes sense that many of us are not willing to sort of say, oh no, there's lots of ways to do it. We're just not comfortable with that. And so I actually that's something I practice all the time. There are lots of ways to do it. And I notice in particular when people do it differently. I'm like, wow, that worked too. Oh, that worked too. And I also think that's a great lesson for your kids. So I was working with someone recently, and she doesn't appreciate her husband's parenting style. And I was like, well, your kids are going to learn from it. They're going to learn either way, right? They're going to learn that they like yours or they like his, or maybe one of them likes his and one of them likes yours because of their personalities. And so I think just seeing that they're going to learn, and there is more than one way to be a parent. I always like to say, just like me, they want happy, healthy children. They just have a very different way of doing it. And when we can accept that, then we can let the other people figure it out. And so I also feel like, just like you, your colleagues in your practice want good care for their patients. So we don't have to go in and micromanage people. We can sort of trust, and I do believe this, like, all doctors are good doctors. They care about their patients. Maybe they're not all fantastic, but they mean well. And so we really should be trusting one another. And yet I think you go back to that residency culture, right? As a second year, you didn't trust the intern. And as a third year, you didn't trust the second year. And it was sort of like you weren't really supposed to trust people along the way. And you weren't really supposed to trust yourself because you had to trust the person above you. And so what a different culture if we actually gifted our belief in people. Like, you're going to be an amazing intern. You can totally handle this. That's a totally different way of thinking about things. I think it brings so much more ease. And with that, we don't get into this hypervigilance, which I think is where a lot of that hyper responsibility culture comes from. Is it has to be right, has to be, as you mentioned, perfect, or close to perfect. And, you know, it does come from the idea of medicine that we can't make a mistake. And yet, again, what's a mistake in, you know, the year 2000 is not a mistake in the year 2005. So part of it is actually even learning from how we do things, and things change over the time, which doesn't mean you want to practice terrible medicine. You don't. I think you're always thinking about, you know, where do you have room? Where could this be done differently? Where do you not have room? And I do love this idea of gifting your belief. Like, imagine if you gifted your belief in your children. Like, of course you can do this. We do get that belief. Like, if you think about a child learning to walk, we don't take responsibility for that. We're like, they're going to figure it out. And we sit there and we watch them fall and fall and fall, but there's no catastrophizing. There's no panicking. We're certain they're going to figure it out. But we don't think that when they're learning to drive, for example. We're like, no, this is scary. And I realize the consequences are bigger. But if you actually gift them your belief that you trust them, they're a way better driver. I have taught 3 people to drive in the last few years, right? Like, they're way better drivers when we gift our belief. And so I think this idea can actually take a lot of the pressure off you. And so much of us have this like elephant on our chest of pressure. And so if I'm back to, if you have a full life rather than you're responsible for everything or caring for everything. I have so many people come to their coaching session saying that I'm just responsible for everything and everyone. It's too much. I'm like, okay, well, give away some of that responsibility, or maybe you're not, or at least come up with a different phrase. And the full life is the one that we've been using recently, and it feels so good to everybody, me included. Anyone else have any thoughts? I think there's lots in there to think about and tweak, like figure out what are the one, you don't want to change everything. Like I gave you lots of different ideas, just pick 1 or 2 and play with them. I think the other thing that we do is we want to go in and fix it all today. And if you just change one thing or 1% or 5%, huge shifts will happen. Like if you can just be a little more spacious and let other people come in and help you a little bit more, all of a sudden you'll have this cascade in the opposite direction. Jillian had the cascade in the stressful direction, but you can have the cascade happen in the opposite direction. And all of a sudden you're like, wow, I didn't do that and it turned out okay. What else can I not do? And slowly you begin to unwind that. It's not a snowball. It's like the, I'm thinking of the tumbleweeds. I don't even know what a tumbleweed is, but slowly it begins to unwind. And I think if we can just allow it to slowly unwind, and when something works, notice it and allow yourself to say, wow, that turned out better than I thought, or not as bad as I thought. And I think then we can step out of it. The other thing is that self-sacrifice and martyrdom, and realizing that we were trained, I was very much trained, like if you didn't approach your doctor career that way, you were not a good doctor and you didn't care. And I would say now it's almost the opposite. Like if you do that, you really can't continue to practice medicine. And medicine is so different, you really can't continue to practice. So to me, it's kind of figuring out, rather, when I use those words, I clearly don't want to be that person anyway, but what is the word of someone? For me, it's what would love do, or what would caring do? And love is fine for me because I take care of kids. So it's like, that works. But you need to figure out what your word is. And I even think with patients, we do love them in sort of the human spirit way, and that can be a really helpful guide. The key there, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is that it's what would love do for you first, and then the patient, and then your family, and then all the other people, and sort of cascading out. But one of the things that we often do is we forget about ourselves in the beginning. And so realizing that we are also included in that. And then it won't steer you wrong, because you don't sacrifice or turn into a martyr, because that love would not do that for you. And love would not be bitter or resentful, honestly. Right? That's not actually love for medicine or patients or partner or any of those things. And many of us we act like martyrs at home, and then we're bitter and resentful about our role at home. And it's like, that's actually not love. We think it's love, but it's not. I did have one woman who culturally said that in her family, moms were supposed to be martyrs, and that was how her mom had raised her. And so there was no way she could ask that question, what would love do? Because when she asked that question, love would be a martyr. Like, that was her immediate answer. So she switched it to what would peace do? And I actually think in this over responsibility realm, peace is really helpful. So that's another way to kind of ask a different question, if that one resonates. And again, it's like the one word, you just have to find your word. And I really like, what would sustainability do? That one feels very neutral to me. So sometimes I'll take those questions and I'll just ask all of them, and then I can figure out, oh, this is a peace situation, or oh, this is a love situation, or oh, this is a sustainability situation. And so I think kind of having them written down can be really helpful when you're not sure or you're feeling stuck. Sorry about my dog. She wants to go out. Hopefully someone will let her. She likes to be in here with me until she doesn't. She's a bit ornery, but I will not take over responsibility for it. And I'll see who else can come by and open the door, because she's being noisy enough. They should all hear her. Any other thoughts? Apparently no one's coming by, but I'm going to let it sit and we'll see how long it takes. There's a teenager out there who should be listening. Yeah, Heather.
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, I think you can't go wrong in almost any situation with what would love do, right? And I actually thank you for that last one. I wanted to go back to that and ask you what you meant by that.
Yeah.
And
my favorite question. I use it for everything.
You know, even better when you said, you know, you give it to yourself first, and then to your patient, partner, kids. I think that's great. It's hard to think you can go wrong with that, actually.
You can't. That's what I think. Like, if you start there, there's no wrong answer, and you will be, I just feel like nobody can judge you if you come from love. That's like this sort of ubiquitous positive feeling. In Vietnam, their hospitals are actually called houses of love. And that actually made me even more like ground into it as a medical thing. Because I was a little, when I first brought it up, like with patients, I was like, some people are not going to feel comfortable with that. But then when I heard about this house of love, I was like, well, there you go. Right. It's actually the Vietnamese people see it and understand it in that way, which I think is beautiful. I wish our hospitals were houses of love. That would be amazing. Medicine would be very different if that were our intention. And I think if you are struggling, like if your brain goes to this, I'm responsible for everything, immediately ask yourself, what would love do? Would it be responsible for everything? No, right? It would share the responsibility, or it would gift belief, or it would take a break, because that is not sustainable.
And I was thinking about kind of similar situation where I used to volunteer for everything at work. And I still work in academia, which they like volunteers.
Yeah,
and,
they do.
Yeah, I got into a situation where I was working for free for 5.5 months, and it completely changed my perspective on volunteering for stuff. I wasn't volunteering at that time. It just was a voluntold situation. But I realized recently that I would have that desire. So like, I can do that, but with your, like, what would love do? I had self-compassion in the moment, and I just was silent. I'm like, let me think about this. Let me think it's my best interest, because in my lab, we're overextended. Everyone's super stressed out. It's palpable, and I'm leaving next year. So I'm like, my excuse is I need to wrap up everything that I'm doing right now. And if I add something else, like, I will not get anything else done. And so it was hard because you felt that guilt.
Yeah.
And then after the guilt, I was feeling like that was a self-compassionate move. And I think it just takes repetition of those things. So even at home, like, do I need to really do that? Like, is it really that important? I live alone, so I try to get my dog to do a lot, but he's not yet that well trained. But so I do, it's just like, but we can always in groups that we have physicians that hire like somebody that helps clean, or somebody that can help watch the kids. And then there's this immediate guilt, but then the relief of it, and then allowing yourself to accept that help and how much pressure it takes off, and not feeling like you're less than, that you are giving this person the opportunity to do what they said that that's what I do for a living, and invite them into your life. So it's been interesting.
We are well practiced at guilt. I always say, like, we were trained to feel guilty. And so I often say what you practice grows. So if you practice volunteering, you're going to keep volunteering. If you practice guilt, you're going to keep feeling guilty, and you're going to keep doing things you don't want to. And so that's where the noticing of these patterns is beautiful. Because if you continue to practice thinking you're responsible for everything and you're caring for everyone and everything, you just continue to feel that way. You feel more and more burdened, and you act in that way. So as soon as you see it and you start to step back, you can then start to practice what would love do, or you can start to practice asking for help, or start to practice believing in other people. And again, I think we feel like we have to do it all at once, but just one smidge by one smidge. The other thing you mentioned there is that default thought pattern of more is better. Right, I should do more and more, and I should volunteer for more, and I should get more done before I leave. And we were trained to do that very much, like get more leadership roles, do more, even sign your kids up for more. Like, we kind of come from this scarcity mindset of what will happen if I don't do it, or that fear of missing out. And so I like to just call out that more is better. Like, more is actually not better. Doing more is not better. I have a middle son who does not do more. He thinks easier is better. I'm like, it's working out great for him, actually, as it turns out. He's 23, and he actually works really hard. He works for a startup in New York City, but somehow, like, he clearly doesn't think that the working hard, like, he's trying to figure out how to make it easier for everyone. That's why he's super successful. And that's always been his way. Like, he's not going to make anything harder than it has to be. And sometimes even our thoughts just make it harder. So I love that we were trained that easy is like not valuable, and actually you should hide if it was easy and not tell anyone that it was easy. And yet, what if that were like having things, and if easy is triggering, it can just be ease. Because for me, it's like easy. Yeah, you got to go hide for that. Like, you should be ashamed if it's easy. That wasn't worthwhile at all. And so I love the idea of allowing that more isn't better, hard isn't better. And finishing up everything, isn't that better?
Yeah, and that finishing up, I asked myself what would be the difference. So I've learned that my values isn't getting publications out there unless it's a blog on Kevin MD, which I enjoy. But scientific publications have lost their value because of so it's quantity over quality right now. So unless it's something I feel really strongly about, like, I'm not that enthused about adding something to the CV. It goes against my integrity to keep doing that, which is why my academic career will probably be cut short, because that's the game you play. So I'm like, well, then I'll just depart, and that's what we do, right? You just shift and pivot in a way that maybe you hadn't considered. And I actually, as you were saying, that there's not just one way. So when I was leaving surgery and I was so out of my mind from the lack of sleep, I thought I had to finish surgery or take my own life. And giving yourself permission to consider other options, just like you're saying here, was life-saving. But it took outside help for me to like see that there were other options. So I think it's so important to have mental flexibility. And if people didn't feel as trapped because it's not a right or wrong way, there is not guilt in leaving or shifting or doing less. I think we could save a lot of lives with this change of mindset.
Yeah, I'm noticing your t-shirt, which says heroes don't wear capes. And I also want to add in, because it seems like it, I can't read the rest of it, actually, something about doctors.
Dog tags. It's
They
actually,
wear dog tags. I like that even better. Because what I was going to say is, I think this idea of labeling us as heroes sets us up for this over responsibility and sets us up for toxic independence. And so if we were humans or we were healers, that feels very different. And then there's sort of a reasonable human expectation. So I love that they were dog tags. I'm like, but I think this idea that, if you're a superhero, there's no limit on what you can do. And if they can do magical things, and yet we are humans and we can't do magical things. And so then the expectations of us become so high. And my belief is that every doctor I know is amazing and works super hard. So nobody's going to like take a pass and be lazy. Nobody I know is. Like, it's really a matter of cutting back to a place where it is sustainable and it's coming from a place of love. And we don't feel burdened and overwhelmed and resentful of colleagues, patients, and people that we love. And this is not because medicine is not broken. I always like to say, I don't teach these tools to make it okay for the system to be this way. But what I have found is when we step out of this over responsibility and self-sacrifice and martyrdom, then our brains get creative because we're not feeling burdened and oppressed. And then we can actually come up with solutions that actually work for the system. And all the other people are not going to come up with the solutions anyway. It takes the smart people who care and understand and love the work. Those are the people that are going to come up with the solutions. But if we're not healthy, we can't. And so these are sort of tools to help you get there so you can begin to think creatively and not feel that threat, right? That sympathomimetic threat of all of the burdens, if that makes sense. Beautiful. So maybe I'm happy to answer more questions, but I'm also happy to end here if you guys are good. I always like to end with a couple deep breaths, because I think when we get in these conversations, we do get a little revved up in the sense of like all the things I need to change and how did I get here and what happened. And so for me, you can do a lot of mindfulness, or you can literally take 3 deep breaths. And I like to think that sometimes it's simple and it doesn't have to be complicated. And so the way that I like to do it is breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, because it makes you pay attention and it's slower. So we'll just do that together. Breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. And we'll do 2 more. You can close your eyes if you want or not. And 1 more into your nose and out through your mouth. And because I love it, bring a hand to heart and the other hand to top. And this hand to heart, we know releases oxytocin, decreases the cortisol in your saliva. And so if you're thinking about what would love do, it would do hand to heart. And whenever you're stuck or feeling overwhelmed or not sure, I always do hand to heart and close my eyes, and it'll tell you what to do next. You can even ask that what would love do question with the hand to heart. And so I envision the palmar surface of the bottom hand pressing in and literally releasing oxytocin and letting it float all over. It feels amazing. And then the study about the cortisol comes from the top hand rubbing skin to skin on the bottom hand. And so I can envision that cortisol melting away. And all of a sudden I have more space to breathe. And you feel better. So you can lower your hands and open your eyes. Thanks for coming and listening. It was lovely to chat with you all on this Sunday evening. Reach out